Hello, everybody. This is Keith Williams. Welcome to OBS Talk Show Presents. Hope everyone is doing okay. And for those of you who are on Facebook Live, thank you so much for tuning in on Facebook Live. And so we are coming upon part 3 of our series of segments on voter education, simply known as Voting 101. We hope that you'll be able to tune in to the other 2 segments that we have. We talked about the basic logistics of voting. In part 1, we have a little history about voting and why is it important. In part 2, we talked about some of the variables, some of the obstacles of voting and what can you do to actually defend voting rights. I also get a couple of resources, particularly from the League of Women Voters and ACLU. They got some great resources on how or what you can do to defend voting rights. So in this segment, we're going to be talking about voter turnout. That has become a topic in every election. It always been talked about after an election has taken place. So once again, I would be sharing my screen here. And we're going to be talking about voter turnout. So when we talk about voter turnout, we're actually talking about how many people went to the polls versus the number of people that have been registered. So with that in mind, we're going to be talking about voter turnout. So the first question is, what do you mean about voter turnout? So let's look at that. So what does voter turnout mean? And so here is our definition. In political science, voter turnout is the participation rate, often defined as those who cast a ballot of a given election. This can be the percentage of registered voters, eligible voters, or all voting age people. According to Stanford University political scientists Adam Hanukkah and Michael McFaul, there is a consensus among political scientists that democracies perform better when more people vote. Yeah, of course, that's pretty much obvious. Institution factors drive the vast majority of differences in turnout rates. For example, simpler parliamentary democracies where votes get shorter ballots, fewer elections, and a multi-party system that makes accountability easier and much higher turnout than those in the United States, Japan, or Switzerland. So when we talk about voter turnout, we're talking about is often done in percentages. And that percentages is the number of people that voted versus the number of people that are registered. And that's how you get the voter turnout percentage. So what is the significance of that? Again, voter turnout is determined about how many people have actually voted versus how many people have actually voted. So the more people that turn out to vote, the higher that percentage is going to be. Some parts of the society are more likely to vote than others. As turnout approached 90%, significant differences between voters and non-voters lessens. But in lower turnout elections, the differences between voters and non-voters can be dramatic. Most importantly, in changing specific election outcomes, voter turnout has semantically long-term implications on ability for democracies to function. For example, regulatory capture tends to affect low voter turnout. And because of that, a lot of democratic reforms are not being implemented. So we also be talking about some factors that affect voter turnout. So one of the things that affect voter turnout is voter fatigue. In part two, I expound a little bit on what voter fatigue is. And we know voter fatigue is the main ingredient behind, is one of the reasons why we have voter apathy. Voter fatigue can lower turnout. If there are many elections in close succession, voter turnout will decrease as the public, basically, they are tired of participating. They gave Switzerland as an example, in which in Switzerland, they vote 7 times a year. That's a lot. And the United States also has frequent elections, usually 2 votes per year on average, if one includes all levels of government as well as a primary. So in the United States, we got 2. So we got a primary here, and then we got a general election. So those are the main ones in the United States. And in some cases, some of your state, so you got state candidates and some of your county candidates often run in either one of those 2, so one of those 2 election cycles. And then you have those off year, elections to where they're mostly your local contests. It can be for mayor, city council, or it can be county commission or things of that level. So we don't have 7 elections in a given year like Switzerland does. Holding multiple elections at the same time can increase voter turnout, and large majorities of both Republicans and Democrats want to consolidate off-cycle elections. So it's been talked to where they kind of like have multiple offices at the same time. So that's why we got the 2 main election cycles, the primary and the general election, and they kind of bunch all of these different offices together in one setting. So when you go to the polls, you'll have this big long ballot, of everyone that's running for office, and it can be federal, it can be state, it can be your local election. So they hold that by condensing that they'll have less election opportunities so that people won't be voter fatigued. Also, another form of voter fatigue can be, like I mentioned before, they can have like a multi-page, ballot where you have few elections, where you have everybody on this one ballot to the point that it can be like a couple of pages long. And that also causes voter fatigue. We see that a lot of times in a lot of races in the United States. Another factor that affects voter turnout is voter registration. For example, in the United States and most Latin American countries, voters must go through separate voter registration procedures before they are allowed to vote. This two-step process quite clearly decreases turnout. U.S. states with no or easier registration requirements have larger turnout. And in a country with a highly efficient registration process is France. At the age of 18, all youths are automatically registered. Only new residents and citizens who have moved are responsible for bearing the cost and inconvenience of updating their registration. Similarity in Nordic countries, that's the like Norway, Sweden, Finland. All citizens and residents are included in the official population register, which is simultaneously, so they use a tax list. So the tax list and voter registration lists and those who receive universal health care are all synonymous. Residents are required by law to report any change of address to the register within a short time after moving. There is a similar system in Germany. So as you can see in a lot of countries, in some countries, you know, when you turn 18 years old, you're automatically registered. You don't have to go through the process of, you know, registering to vote like you do in the United States. In certain countries, when you turn the legal age to vote, you're automatically registered. So you automatically, you know, go in as a voter. If you're eligible to vote, you're automatically registered. And also in certain states in the United States, they're trying to make it easier to vote. Like in my last example, in the last segment, I mentioned that one of the things that you can do is lobby to your legislators to say, we need an easier process for people to register to vote and to vote, period. So I think that automatic registration and or finding, you know, easier, less stressful ways or multiple options to vote is a really good idea, because that will, if you do that, and more than likely there would be a higher turnout rate in elections. Another thing that affects voter turnout is what you call compensatory voting. What is compensatory voting? We need to find out what that means. What does it mean by compensatory voting? And so in order to understand this part, we have to understand what compensatory voting is. Okay, so give me a moment. Let me pull that up. Okay, so compensatory voting is also known as mandatory voting. And in this instance, in certain countries, there are actually laws in the books in which it is required for all eligible voters to vote in elections, regardless of what it is. And there are penalties if mandatory voting is violated. You have, according to CIA World Factbook, 21 countries, including 10 Latin American countries, officially have mandatory voting laws as of December of 2021, with a number of these countries not enforcing. So they have these laws, but they're not enforced. So a majority of these countries are not, you know, enforcing it, even though they have it on the books. Of course, here in the United States, we do not have mandatory voting, but I do believe that we should have a system to where there is a mandatory registration, meaning that everybody who meets the requirements should, of course, it should be mandatory for them to register to vote. So that's where compulsory voting, does. Some people suggest that if you have mandatory voting, that will increase voter turnout. Well, that might not necessarily, be so, because there are instances where people break the law. So even though mandatory or compulsory voting does affect voter turnout, some countries, they are not enforcing it, and therefore it's going to be like you have a choice whether or not to vote or not, and it's something that is not being strictly, enforced. And if there are violations of compulsory voting, the penalties are mild because they don't deem it to be a criminal offense. Okay, another thing that affects voter turnout is what we call salience. What is salience? We need to define what the word salience. So when we talk about salience, we're talking about the fact that a particular issue or a particular person is noticeable or important. Again, when we talk about salience, it simply means that a particular issue or a particular person is noticeable or important. And I think sometimes when we talk about elections, we call that name recognition, meaning that one of the reasons why we vote for certain folks is because they're noticeable, they're important, they are popular. So in terms of this conversation, when we talk about salience, we're also talking about someone or something that is noticeable or important. And so when we talk about candidates that are running for office, per se, this term applies because the more you put your name out there, the more noticeable you become, the more important you become. That's what salience means. And so the two-party system that we have here in the United States, Democrat and Republicans, they practice this in an effort to, get elected. Sometimes voter turnout depends on the type of candidates, that are running for office. If you find out that a lot of candidates that are running that are noticeable or great importance, not only will they get behind this candidate, meaning they will campaign for them, they will donate, they will provide resources, but they will also go to the polls and vote for this person. Also, too, if there's an issue that is noticeable or of great importance, then people will go out to the polls for that as well. So when we talk about salience, that's what that means. Okay, another factor that determines voter turnout is what we call proportionality. proportionality, or how something, where the proportionality determines what is popular and what is not, popular. So that's what that means. So proportionality and salience is kind of, go hand in hand. Okay, proportionality suggests that who determines what is popular, or who is popular and who is not. Again, political parties use this, all the time, and they do this through political organizations, sometimes political parties, and this in turn affects, voter turnout. If anything goes wrong here, in this case, in proportionality, that means that you're going to have a low voter turnout because people are going to be turned off by this. Okay, now the last thing that affects voter turnout is the ease of vote. Other methods, in other words, are we trying to make it easier for people to vote, or we are engaged in voter suppression, making it harder or difficult for people to vote? Other methods of making voting easier is to increase voter turnout, is including vote by mail, absentee polling, and improved access to polls, such as increasing the number of possible voting locations, lowering the average time voters have to spend waiting in lines, or requiring companies to give workers some time off on voting. Uh, Personally, I feel that whenever you have an election day, that day should be a holiday. And also, you want to make it easier for people who have physical or mental disabilities to be able to vote as well. In some areas, generally those where some polling places are relatively inaccessible, elections could take several days. I think there was in the past when we didn't have all this different technology that elections spread out over different days. And I think it was somewhere in the late 1800s or going into the 20th century that elections started to be on one day because we had new technologies to the point where elections, we had new technologies that made it accessible for multiple people to go to the polls and vote on a single day rather than spreading it out over different days. In some countries, they use what is called internet voting because they utilize the internet for people to vote. Only problem with that with a lot of hacking malicious content that may go around, internet voting would probably be difficult, to do because you got to make sure that the system which is being used, sometimes it will probably be used on the cloud method, has to be secure, or it can be like it can be an app, it can be web based or something like that. But you have to make sure that that process is secure. So internet voting kind of have some mixed results. But if it's safely secure, that can definitely uh, increase voter turnout, especially if we have an app. You know how many people use a phone these days? That's a great way to get people to vote. Vote from their phones, vote on the app. Because we got millions of people that use their phone. Also, what will create an ease in voting is to do early voting, have longer opening and closing. We have longer hours of operation in polling places, because we know that a lot of people, they are working and it's difficult for them to take time off. So we want to accommodate them. And so they're saying in this study that was in 2017, that if that happens, then there will be an increase in voter turnout. So now that we know about the factors, how do we measure voter turnout? So one of the things they look at is called a numerator. A numerator is simply ballots accepted. A numerator is the number of ballots accepted or the number of votes cast. That's the first part. So this is kind of like a numerator and a denominator in fractions. So if you're familiar with fractions, they're using the same concept here. So let's break down and measure voter turnout. First thing we need to look at is the numerator. The numerator is a ballot accepted or cast. For the numerator, it is often assumed that this is the number of voters who went to the polls. So these are the people who actually went to the polls and who voted. That's what the numerator is. In turn, a numerator suggests that these are the number of voters or registered voters who went to the polls and cast their ballot. It also suggests that this equals the number of votes that are counted, but that's not always the case. Not all voters who arrive at the polls necessarily cast a ballot. Some may be turned away because they are ineligible. Some may be turned away improperly. And some who signed the voting register may not actually cast a ballot. Furthermore, voters who do not cast ballots may abstain, deliberately voting for no one, or they may spoil their votes, either accidentally or in an act of protest. So when we talk about the numerator, what exactly are we talking about? In the United States, it has been common to report turnout as the sum of votes from the top race on the ballot, because not all jurisdictions report the actual number of people who went to the polls, nor the number of undervotes or overvotes. Overvote rates are around 0.3%, typically well-run elections. But it can get as high as 11%, as it did in Gaston County, Florida in November of 2000. So when we're talking about the numerator, what are we talking about? We're basically talking about the number of votes that was actually counted. So these are people who, registered voters, who went to the polls, they voted, and their vote was counted. So that's the numerator. Next, we have the denominator. These are people who are of voting age, who are eligible to vote, and who are registered to vote. For the denominator, it is often assumed that the number of eligible voters as well as defined, but again, this is not the case. In the United States, for example, there are no accurate registry of exactly who is eligible to vote, since only about 75% of people choose to register themselves. Thus, turnout has to be calculated based on the population estimates. Some political scientists have argued that these measures do not properly account for the large number of legal permanent residents, illegal aliens, disenfranchised felons, and persons who are considered mentally incompetent in the United States, and that American voters turnout is higher than normally reported. So when we're talking about the denominator, what does that mean? I would have to go with the number of people that are actually registered. So here in the denominator, we're talking about, votes that was actually counted. That means that means registered voters who actually go to the polls and voted, and their vote was counted. That's the numerator. And then for the denominator we define that as the people who are actually registered. They are actually on the voters' roll. That's your denominator. So we define, how do we measure voter turnout? Numerator, the number of votes that was actually counted, and the denominator, the number of people who have actually registered to vote and are on the voters' roll. So that's the numerator, and that's the denominator. Okay, so let's look at some. I want to look at some trends in the United States. Again, we look at these things that what has not been listed on here is voter apathy also affects voter turnout, because if you have different barriers to elections, that means a lot of people would be excluded, and that would actually decrease voter turnout. Same thing with voter apathy. If you got people that just simply would not vote, or they feel that their vote is not going to count, then that also going to decrease voter turnout. It's not listed on here, but those two are very important. Oftentimes we see boycotts and demonstrations that are going on during political campaigns during the election season, and that also affects voter turnout. That also increases voter fatigue as well as voter apathy. Definitely a trend, that's what's going on. It's mostly with younger people, but we're now seeing that eligible voters ages 18 to 30, they are increasingly participating in the voting process. So we're beginning to see an increase in voter turnout among young people. Georgia, of course, is a perfect example. The senatorial runoff race between Raphael Warnock, the incumbent, and Herschel Walker, the challenger. We saw an increase in young voters in that particular, election. So that's a good example of the trends that's going on here. Another factor that affects voter turnout is what we call negative campaign. Some call it mudslinging. For example, is propaganda, used to discourage, people from, either voting for a particular candidate or voting, period. And a lot of people are turned out by negative ads. And so when we find out that there's a lot of negative ads, people more than likely are going to stay home. Or if we on the flip side of that, there actually been some things that encourage, people to vote. I call it positive campaign. For example, you had the entertainment industry have gotten help, to this, such as MTV's Rock the Vote. Sure, y'all remember that, especially during the '90s, where you have entertainers from all genres. They, did a series of public service announcements encouraging people to vote, and it was highly successful. A lot of people, got out to vote, and it was, highly successful. Also, you have what is called the Ride or Die campaign, which, of course, both of these was geared towards younger people, ages 18 to 25. And that, of course, it was highly effective and increased voter turnout. Definitely study that. And then some of the candidates got creative as well. Remember what Bill Clinton did during his campaign? He appeared on all the late night talk shows. I think Barack Obama did something similar to that. And that got people, excited. One of the things I admire about Bill Clinton's campaign is that his campaign was youth-centered. So when he talked about, so he identified himself as being an agent of change, in a country that was in turmoil at that time. That resonated with a lot of young people because, they were saying, hey, I'm tired of dealing with the same thing. I want to see some change. So that resonated with young people, and that's what got young people out to vote. Barack Obama did something similar to that in 2018, and that drove young people out to vote. So if you do not think that that's important, yes, highly, that is highly important. And they got some other factors here, such as what they call decision theory is a probability. What they would do, a perfect example is that if you ever watch election coverage, you'll notice that that the networks make a projection of who won the race. Uh, Part of the reason why they do that is what is called decision theory. Is a probability using numbers to based on sample precincts how the election is going to go, and it's being fed in a computer. It is also based on trends from previous elections to determine how the election in a particular district or state is going to go. They call it decision theory, and all networks use that. Okay. Sometimes that will affect voter turnout. For example, if some people say, well, this elections always have been decided. Perfect example of this in the United States is that, we know the votes, if you live in the Eastern time zone or the Central time zone, well, those votes are going to be counted first, especially when we're talking about a presidential election. Those votes are going to be counted first because those are the first areas where the polls are going to be closed. Whereas if you live in the Mountain time zone or the Pacific time zone, your polls are still open. Well, it could be It could be that the race could be decided in the Eastern and Central time zone, for example. And then people may feel, well, why am I going to vote? The presidential race has already been decided. But what a lot of people don't know is that you got other offices, you got senators, you got House representatives, you got governors, you got local offices, that are also on your ballot. So it's not just the president, vice president is on the ballot. You have, all these other offices. So it's very important that you vote for your local who you want to represent you locally, not just the presidential, election. And that's why you hear anchors report say, regardless of all that, go vote. That's why. That's why they say that. But don't let these projections fool you. This is kind of, their way to, analyze, trends in past elections or present, elections. And unfortunately, the decision theory as political scientists puts it, it does affect voter turnout. So let's look at that. So the basic formula is PB plus D is greater than C. So the P in this equation is the probability that an individual vote would affect the outcome of an election. The B in this equation means that it's perceived benefit that would be received that person's. So in other words, B is talking about talking about, well, basically this person, this candidate is going to be, this candidate political party is going to be favored in this election. The D in this equation represents democracy or civic duty, but today it represents any social or personal gratification of an individual who gets from voting. Some people are like really exciting about voting. They're really gung-ho about democracy. And then you have some people that are not. That's what the D stands for. And then the C is the time, effort, and financial costs involved, in voting. If you have a problem with C, on here, then if you have a problem with C, if C has a negative condemnation, then voter turnout is going to be low. But if C is high or positive, then they suggest that voter turnout is going to be high because it's going to be, less time is involved, less effort is involved, and the cost would be lower, as well. Because keep in mind, holding an election costs money. So this is the equation that's being used, is known as the decision theory. So again, we're going over some more factors that determine voter turnout. One of them is a habit. Voter turnout differences appear to persist over time. In fact, the strongest predicator of individual turnout is whether or not one voted in the previous election. As a result, many scholars think of turnout as a habitual behavior that can be learned or unlearned, especially among young adults. So as an example, in the last, I talked about you have middle-aged voters tend to vote more, and you have those that are 65 years or older. I would consider them to be habitual voters, because these are the groups that tend to go out and vote the most. Whereas you have those who are 18 to 30, not so much. So, not so much. And again, it says that it can be learned, it can be, it can be, online. It can be through education. It can be through misinformation. It can be through, propaganda, whether the propaganda is negative or positive, whether it's beneficial or not beneficial. This in turns determine uh, how often people vote in elections. Another one would be childhood, influences. It suggests that children that receive a high quality education, um, especially political education, would most likely be not only habitual voters, but that will also increase voter turnout. Another thing that affects um, voter turnout is demographics. Now, this one is very important. There are many socioeconomic factors that are associated whether an individual has developed a habit of voting or not. Most important socioeconomic factor affecting voter turnout is education. The more educated a person is, the more likely they are to vote, even controlling for other factors that are closely associated with education levels, such as income and class. Income has some effect independently. Wealthier people are more likely to vote, regardless of their educational background. There is some debate over the effects of ethnicity, race, and gender. In the past, these factors unquestionably influenced turnout in many nations. But nowadays, the consensus among political science is that these factors have little effect in Western democracies when education and income differences are taken into account. Now, this one right here, I kind of have to disagree with that because here in the United States, for example, ethnicity, and race definitely determine voter turnout. How so? Oh, so right now, we're still dealing with voter suppression, to which voter suppression alienates and disenfranchise African Americans and people of color. So if you do that, that's definitely going to affect voter turnout, which means voter turnout is going to be low because you have some groups that are being, excluded. A 2018 study found that while education did not increase turnout on average, it did raise turnout among individuals from low socioeconomic status households. Really? Public sector employees have higher voter turnout than private sector employees. However, since different ethnic groups typically have different levels of education and income, there are important differences in turnout between such groups in many societies. Okay. Again, in the United States, when we're dealing with, voter suppression, voter turnout is going to be lower because you will have certain groups that are going to be left out, alienated, disenfranchised, or whatever you want to call it. So that part definitely determines voter turnout. One suggests, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that um, time zone. I think I mentioned that earlier in the example I just gave you about the presidential election. So let's go back to that. So let's say that if you live in the Eastern and Central time zone, those votes are going to get counted first versus those who live in Pacific time zone in the Mountain time zone. And then there have been some cases to where the presidential election has been decided before they have the results from your Western state. And that in turn can turn some people off, and that will affect, voter turnout because again, I said, well, they have already, projected who the president is going to be. And I live in Los Angeles, California. So why am I voting for president when they have already predicted that a candidate has won. And so again, that would affect voter turnout. But in Canada, they have actually banned broadcasting of election results in any region where the polls have not yet closed, a ban that was upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada. Wow. Another thing that affects voter turnout is what type of election that you have. Here in the United States, voter turnout tends to be high when we are electing a president during a presidential election than it is in a midterm. That's a proven fact. Except in cases to where if you have state offices that are being elected, that can be kind of tricky. It can go up, it can go down. It just, all depends. But typically, voter turnout is higher during a presidential election than it is in a midterm election. And if there is a runoff, in either one of these instances, voter turnout tends to be lower than it is during a general election, whether it's a national general election or it's a midterm general election. Runoffs always tend to have low voter turnout, and midterm elections tend to have lower voter turnout. Also, one of the factors is competitive races. In theory, one of the factors that is most likely to increase voter turnout is a close race. Rough an example would be the Senate runoff race in Georgia between Warnock and Walker, to where the incumbent won. I think it was race was close. Each of them have over 1 million votes. So it was like real close. It was probably less than 3% or 2% or something like that, but it was real close. It was a highly competitive race and one of the most closely, watched races. Another example would be the 2017 special election in Alabama between Doug Jones and Roy Moore. That was not only a competitive race, but it was also a controversial, race as well. And that race received a lot of national attention. Another example of this would be the 2000 presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore, and which the race was solely concentrated on, Florida. And so whoever won Florida pretty much won the presidency, even though all the other states, votes came in. Florida's race, the race in Florida was considered to be controversial and most watchable. And you probably noticed too that in that race, the number of electoral college votes between the two was also close, as well as the popular vote was also close as well. Let's look at 2004. It was a close finish between the incumbent George W. Bush and John Kerry. The turnout for that election was 60%, resulting in a record number of popular votes for both candidates. Bush had 62 million and Kerry had 59 million, so that was close. That was a close race. Historically, you had a high voter turnout in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln ran against Stephen Douglas. Voter turnout was 81.2%. That is a historical high. And the next highest voter turnout was in 1876, where the percentage was, the voter turnout was 81.8%. They said that Bill Clinton's race in 1996 was the lowest voter turnout in the United States since 1924. It was a low voter turnout there. So the competitive of the races also determines voter turnout. In Alabama, of course, Alabama has a history, for example, has a history of low voter turnout. And I think the average is like 25%. Don't see how, for example, in 2018, when we have the highest slate of, of candidates in the state's history, yet that average of 25%, remains. So we have to look at that. What caused that low voter turn? That means 1/4 of all registered voters have actually cast their ballots. It's been that way in the state for a very long time, and you have similar states that have similar numbers, but in your swing states like Pennsylvania, you got your New York, you got your Florida, you got Georgia, Michigan, Ohio. Those states tend to have high voter turnout because of some of the factors that I have. You have a lot of competitive races there. You have a lot of popular candidates that are running. These are the states where candidates spend the most money, and so all of these factors, determine voter turnout. Oh, we have some plenty more. Those who have been previously incarcerated. We see here in the United States that average of 4 to 6 million Americans with a felony record has been denied, the right to vote. And having these 5 to 6 million people have the opportunity to vote, that of course will increase voter turnout. But keep in mind that even though a person may have a felony record, does not necessarily mean that they have committed a crime of moral turpitude. So in that case, that person would have to go through a process to where their voting rights had to be restored. But through intervention of state, through legislation, the process could be a lot easier for those who have been convicted of a felony, would be able to have their rights restored. Another thing that affects voter turnout is cost of participation. We really don't have that problem here in the United States, so I'm just going to skip that. But sometimes, so let's say that you do get to vote by mail, but you got to pay your own postage. Some people may not want to do that, and that would discourage them from voting. Also, I would call that a modern day version of a poll tax. But if you have a system to where people can vote by mail, and you see on the envelope, uh, no purchase is necessary if living in the United States, then people will be more than likely to submit their vote by mail, thus increase voter turnout. Another thing that affects voter turnout, is knowledge. How much you know about the candidates, how much you know about the issues, how much you know about the election process, how much you know about the voting process. If that type of information is not easy and acceptable, that will discourage people from voting, and you're going to have a low voter turnout. Now, there have been voting pledges, as well as in recent years, and especially now that's geared towards young people. There was a 2018 study, here that suggests that young people who pledge to vote are more likely to turn out than those who are contacted using the standard get out the vote material. So I think with young people, you kind of have to be creative. Uh, like MTV did back in the 90s, BET did something similar. They was like really creative and, and establishing a campaign for young people to get out the vote. I think we need to go back to that. If Because that greatly affected voter turnout, especially among uh, young voters. Another thing that affects voter turnout is the weather. People tend to, there's been studies that suggest that, now this can vary. Now, if you have a competitive election, um, weather disruptions is not really going to affect that. But if they're not competitive, races, and people feel that this election is not really, important, then if you get a rainstorm or snowstorm, if it's cold, they might not be able to come out. Some researchers also investigate the effects of temperature on turnout, with some finding increased temperatures to moderately increase turnout. In other words, people like if it's sunny outside or if it's warm or mild, or even cool, then people will probably come out. If it's raining or storming or it's like real cold, then this study suggests that you're probably gonna have a low voter turnout. In terms of time, here now we know here in the United States, elections are always fall on a Tuesday. That could greatly affect, voter turnout, as is one of the days of the week where people, got to work. Now, if you have early voting or voting on Saturday, then that will increase voter turnout because you have a significant amount of population that don't work on Saturday. And so they have time to, cast their ballot. So if you have early registration, if it's on a Saturday, then that's going to increase voter turnout, according to the survey. The season of the day of the week can also affect turnout. Weekend and summer elections find more of the population on holiday or uninterested in politics will have a low voter turnout. I can definitely, relate to that. Especially if you have especially if you have an election in June, July, or August. That definitely going to affect voter turnout. But it says if it's during the spring or fall months, then that would maximize, turnout. Variations in turnout between elections tend to be insignificant. So it's not really, this one is kind of tricky, right here. It is extremely rare for factors such as competitiveness, weather, and time of year to cause an increase or decrease in turnout of more than 5%, far smaller than the differences between groups within society, and far smaller than turnout differentials between nations. So I guess it's saying that this one can be tricky, and having to deal with weather and timing does not does not necessarily maximize turnout, but in some cases, it is. Household socialization, what is that about? A 2018 study in the American Political Science Review found that parents to newly enfranchised voters become 2.8 percentage points more likely to vote. A 2018 study in the form of political behavior found that increasing the size of households increases a household member's propensity to vote, according to this study. A 2018 Pius One study found that a partisan who is married to a co-partisan is more likely to vote. That simply means if you have a husband and wife that belong to the same political party, they were more likely to vote. Now that they're from different, political parties, they said that according to the study, more than likely they would not. And also abstination also affects voter turnout. There is a philosophical, moral, and practical reason that some people cite for not voting in electoral politics, typically owing to obstacles to voting. That could be a factor for people not voting because there are too many obstacles. Some people might say, well, I feel that my vote is not going to count, or they are dealing with a lot of barriers, to voting. So they don't come out to vote. That's called abstination. Okay, so some of those are some of the factors. So that's what voter turnout is, and that's basically what voter turnout is, and some of the factors, how it's being, calculated. Now let's look at some of the. If I can, I will look at some of the, you know, look at some of the numbers. We'll look at some of the numbers where we're talking about recent numbers. So when we compare the United States to other nations of the world, United States is number 9 with an average of 62% voter turnout in a presidential election. We are behind Spain at 65%. Belgium took the top spot at 78%. We're talking about a midterm election here. So, so midterm election nationwide, the voter turnout rate was 67%. this is actually a significant increase from 50% in the last midterm election. That is fantastic. The estimated number of people who were eligible to vote based on their age was about 329.9 million as of 2020, but only 158.38 million showed up to the polls and vote. That's roughly about 50%, but in 2020. But this year is 67%. Okay, so these are the states with the highest voter turnout in the 2020 election according to rank. Some of these, of course, are swing states. Like you got like Michigan, Virginia. Virginia is a swing state. Michigan is a swing state. Wisconsin is a swing state. And like I said earlier, swing states tend to have a higher turnout rate than non-swing states. Okay, now here is the states with the lowest, voter turnout. Again, Alabama is at the bottom. Okay, so those are some of the numbers. So let's look at some historical, if I can. So overall, out of all the nations in the world, United States is number 9 in terms of voter turnout. As I said earlier, we're beginning to see an increase in voter turnout, nationwide, but we're still lagging behind other countries. I remember we was, number 9. For example, in the 2020 election, the 62% of people of voting age, according to the Census Bureau, actually came out to vote. This was up from 47.5% in 2018. But we're still lagging behind, other countries. So in 2020, United States was number 31. In 2022, we bump up to number 9. That's pretty good. Just give you a few numbers here. So that lets you know that we got some work. That lets you know we got some work to do. But nevertheless, I hope that you have enjoyed this little segment on voter turnout. How does it work? I gave you some numbers as to the most recent elections from 2016 to 2022, kind of give you an idea of how, serious voter turnout is and how, hopefully, we will have a conversation as to, what we need to do to get more people out to vote. So I'm glad that everyone was able to tune in to today. We will wrap this segment up on tomorrow. And on tomorrow, we will talk about some of the ways that hopefully will be able to motivate you to get out to vote, and what can I do to, help people become a part of the election process. So that would be on tomorrow. So I hope that you will join me then. So thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great day.